What do you think are some of the greatest films with feminist themes? While I'm sure the films you thought of are great examples, unless the title of the video swayed you, you likely didn't name any horror films. Horror films do not spring to mind for many in discussions of feminist films, and for a fair reason. The genre has a long history of violence towards women, often as motivation for male protagonists, as well as the exploitation of their bodies. On that note, I just want to forewarn anyone watching this that there will be mentions and video of violence, gore, and sexual assault in this video. Carol Clover explores these representations in her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, wherein she coined the now commonly used term, final girl. Let's take a look at Clover's description of the final girl, alongside one of the most famous final girls, and one that Clover analyzes in her book, Laurie Strode from the Halloween franchise. Clover describes the final girl as the one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and her own peril, who is chased, cornered, wounded, whom we see scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. She alone looks death in the face, but she alone also finds the strength to either stay the killer long enough to be rescued or kill him herself. The final girl is different from her friends. She is the Girl Scout, the bookworm, the mechanic, and is not sexually active. She notices small signs of danger that her friends ignore, and she's intelligent and resourceful in extreme situations. Clover says the final girl is boyish, as her smartness, gravity, competence in mechanical and other practical manners, and her sexual reluctance set her apart from the other girls and ally her with the boys. Lastly, Clover says that the final girl's name will often allude to this boyish nature, citing characters like Stevie, Terry, Stretch, and of course, Laurie. Though, as we will see, the figure of the final girl in mainstream horror has evolved in many ways since these representations. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the evolving representations from some of the original final girls to more contemporary films and feminist figures. So, only 1 year after the release of the original Halloween movie came the release of Ridley Scott's Alien, starring Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley. While Ripley's portrayal is admirable because she is not defined by her relationship to men, and she takes leadership in her role amongst the Nostromo crew, where the film blatantly fails in its feminist portrayal is the scene where Ripley strips at the end of the film. Despite Sigourney's belief that after 5 days of blood and guts and fear and sweat and urine, do you think Ripley wouldn't take off her clothes? But the scene ultimately falls victim to the voyeuristic male gaze discussed by Laura Mulvey in visual pleasure narrative cinema. Additionally, Ripley forgoes her femininity to exert power and engage with the male audience members. Even the identification with her last name instead of her first helps bury her femininity. Ripley signifies the acceptable form and shape of a woman. Her body is pleasurable and reassuring to look at, whereas the film's other woman, Joan Lambert, is coded as much more feminine, and furthermore is treated with less respect. She's often shown in hysterics and does not possess the rational thinking and level-headedness of the masculine code of Ripley. Even her highly criticized death scene reinforces femininity as her downfall. Therefore, despite making some strides towards a better feminist portrayal of final girls in horror, Alien ultimately fails at meeting that ideal. The Silence of the Lambs deals with feminist themes much more head-on than previous horror films. Unlike Ripley, Clarice Starling does not have to forego her femininity to have powerful agency in the film, though the film also deals with the ways in which femininity is objectified and abused by men. Clarice is often looked at as an other by her FBI peers, and has to deal with sexual advances in extremely inappropriate circumstances during her investigation. The film reinforces these advances and male gazes by showing them in point-of-view shots from Clarice's perspective, which aligns male spectators with Clarice and shows them in some capacity what it's like to be a woman and fall under this male gaze. As well, though the film states that Buffalo Bill is not truly transgender, showing someone doing the vile acts who thinks that they are transgender can easily be misconstrued by audiences as perpetrating negative views of trans women, and presents a poor image of women in that sense. As well, Clarice also just accepts much of the inappropriate behavior of the professionals around her instead of calling out these men for their misogyny, Jodie Foster once said that she, like her character Clarice, both believe
you have to be a part of the system in order to change the system.
This is very different from the modern final girls, who are more inclined to tear down patriarchal systems and then rebuild, rather than trying to modify them. Jennifer's Body is an extremely interesting case. In many ways, it signals a new iteration of horror cinema that plays with and exposes the gendered conventions of the genre. It was extremely progressive and dealt with a plethora of feminist themes, most prominently the complicated friendships of teenage girls, which were all portrayed well because of its strong female presence behind the camera. But while the film itself was progressive, its marketing campaign was entirely centered around Megan Fox's sex appeal that was so heavily exploited in Michael Bay's Transformers movies that Fox was known for at the time. Though director Karyn Kusama actively objected these advertisements, her attempts to mend these were met with no help from the advertising team. Kusama even once received an email from them that only said, "Jennifer's sexy, she steal your boyfriend." And they even suggested that Fox should host an amateur porn site to promote the film. While many critics also panned the film for its exploitative kiss between the two female leads, which was originally intended as the climax of the film's queer subtext to which mainstream audiences were less likely to pick up on at the time. As well, the influence of the film's exploitative marketing changed how audiences perceived the film. So while this was a time when some creatives in Hollywood were ready to make more feminist films, those with the power at studios and most audiences were not ready for films like Jennifer's Body, as Kusama explains. I was like, oh, okay. We are seeing either we made a movie that they see completely differently, or what's in front of them is something that they don't want to see. Women have always enjoyed horror films, even since the 1930s, but studios did not seem to notice this until the 1990s, when they started to make more horror films with women audiences in mind. Since then, directors like Jordan Peele and Ari Aster have reinvigorated the horror genre and forced critics to begin taking horror films as seriously as other Hollywood films, and thus have begun to feature many strong feminist representations of final girls. Without even looking at the evolution we just analyzed, you can take Laurie Strode from Halloween, who we talked about earlier, who first hit screens in 1978, and who has recently come back to cinemas 40 years later, and is now completely transformed from a passive character to one who wants to hunt down Michael Myers. Through this long evolution, horror has become an ideal genre for representing feminist figures and tackling feminist themes and issues. What makes horror such a compelling genre is its ability to hyperbolize themes that other films may only discuss. This can be seen in films like They Live, which exaggerates the themes of corrupt governments and literally reveals politicians to be evil monsters. Or more recently, Get Out, which takes concepts like racism in the United States and the violence against black men and women, and exaggerates it as literally stealing away these lives, and the oppression that black people face becomes the sunken place. So horror becomes an ideal medium for feminist stories because it can take feminist issues and hyperbolize them to really bring it to people's attention and explore it in interesting ways. Like in the film Ready or Not, the theme of the controlling patriarch and the lack of control for women in the patriarchy is hyperbolized when the family literally hunts down the bride for sport because of the patriarch's tradition. This can even be seen more specifically in the film through Grace's dress, which she continually rips in the film as it drags her down, just like the patriarchy would, and she uses it instead to become bandages and other tools that will help her survive and fight back. This can even be seen in Jennifer's Body, which takes sexual assault and turns it into a satanic ritual to highlight how horrible and vile rape is to people who have not experienced such awful things. Through the horror genre, these themes are able to be explored in a deeper way and in a way different from other genres. Feelings that might have been missed by the spectator in other genres can be put on the surface through this hyperbolization, and it makes hard to grasp concepts easier for some, seeing it in literal terms. Both in life and in film, patriarchal structures deem that it is unfit for women to be angry. As Laura Mulvey said, the male gaze in film posits the women as object of the combined male gaze of spectator and all the male protagonists in the film. She is isolated, glamorous, on display, sexualized. Women are therefore valued for their voyeuristic pleasure that they can provide for men. And seeing women angry does not create this pleasurable experience that the male gaze craves. Despite this obviously being misogynistic, women still rarely get to express rage in films, especially in comparison to men. Horror then becomes a perfect genre for women to finally get to express their anger. In a movie like Hereditary, by the filmmaker's own admission, it's more of a family drama for the first half of its runtime. Toni Collette's character, Annie, gets to express her outrage at her teen son while processing grief in a way that she likely would not have gotten to do if this family drama wasn't also a horror film. While women should be allowed to express this anger in all genres that a man can, for now, horror becomes a way that actresses can prove that they have just as much rage to express as men. Though this anger is not confined to speeches like Colette's in Hereditary. The anger by women shown through acts of violence can be read as destabilizing gendered constructions of aggression and resistance, since in most other films, physical aggression is predominantly constructed as a masculine preserve through which real men can dominate other men and women. The rage displayed by women in horror films also has the ability to offer a cathartic outlet in which women can exercise rather than exercise expressions of rage. Horror films allow for a catharsis for spectators that no other genre can replicate. The rush of relief felt when the antagonist is finally defeated is both audible and palpable when watching a good horror film in theater. And when this catharsis is applied to a film with feminist themes, it can provide a unique feeling for its audience besides an expression of rage. It can give a win for women in the audience who might not have gotten a win in real life. With a film like Midsommar, despite the film's ending being pretty bleak in actuality, as Danny has now joined a cult, many people were cheering during the final frames because after 2 hours of seeing Danny being treated horribly by her awful boyfriend Christian, people felt a catharsis seeing Danny end her relationship by, well, burning him alive. This same catharsis is felt by the end of The Witch when Thomasin is finally able to escape her abusive family and join the Coven of Witches. Women who have been in similar but more grounded situations watching these films get the satisfaction of a win in situations where they might not have been able to get in real life, and these films may validate their own experiences of trauma. Through horror's long evolution, and therefore the evolution of the final girl, it's made it a great format for telling feminist stories. And though it has come a long way as a genre, like Hollywood as a whole, it needs to tell feminist stories through more than just able-bodied, straight, cis white women, as well as including more women behind the camera, as the majority of the films that I've discussed in this essay were made by men. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them in the comments below, as ultimately, I'm a cis man writing about these women, and though I've used many theories by women to analyze these films, I will never really understand what it likes to be a woman, so I'd love to hear any input about anything I've had to say. Thank you.